So welcome to this week's Haftarah class. I will kick it off by admitting two things that I did not really understand about the Haftarah and the Nevi'im until we started diving deep into this subject. The first is that the Haftarah varies widely from year to year on any given parsha, whether you're sitting in a Sephardi shul or an Ashkenazi shul, whether you happen upon a Shabbat that is special, as this one is, which I did not realize until about 2 o'clock this afternoon, once I'd prepared a beautiful shir on Amos, which is the Haftarah we would have read were it not to be Shabbat Hanukkah, which was disappointing to me because I really liked it. So I want to start there and stay there for a minute. But I also just want to step back and say I think that is interesting and exceptional that the Haftarah changes so frequently. I think something nice about Torah reading in general is that you go to any Orthodox or conservative shul around the world and we read the same thing every year on the same date. Now, of course, if like Sukkot falls on Shabbat, we do sort of change things, but I find the shifting Haftarahs to be a little bit disorienting. And I wonder if I paid such close attention another year, whether I would find it more interesting because it's more varied. I certainly, I noticed that, I was lamenting this factor of Ari. I said, I can't believe I started to prepare this nice year. I got so excited about it. I listened to a podcast by someone named Rabbi Trump, who works in Cedarhurst, Long Island, and he has a really great podcast on the Haftarah, and it was a really beautiful podcast, and I was delving into all the sources for it. I think it's called Epilogues, his podcast. Yes, it's on the OU website. It's called Epilogues. I highly recommend it, but not if you're planning to come to this class because there's a high chance a lot of it will be found here. So that's thing that surprises me, number one. Oh, I know what I was saying is that Rav Ari said kindly, well, just teach the class on Amos, like otherwise we miss it every year. But I noticed that because this is the year immediately preceding a leap Adar, right, an extra Adar, that actually Hanukkah almost never falls now. So next year we'll delve even deeper into Amos. It's pretty likely that we'll get to learn him on this parsha. But the one thing I want to say is that for the last 2 or 3 weeks, I feel like I imagine we all together have struggled with the references to Edom, right? Esav has been painted in one color throughout the Nevi'im as a villain, as someone who's evil, as someone who God will cut down, and we in direct sort of relation will rise up. And I think I've shared a few times that I'm troubled by that. That's not the way I want to think about Esav, but I understand the context of the time and the desire to understand Esav in that way. This week, however, I was excited to say that we've turned to our actual own worst enemy, which is, of course, ourselves. The reference that ties these chapters of Amos to this parsha in a normal year is the reference to the brothers selling Yosef for shoes or money or something like that. And Amos laments, like, how terrible has our nation become that we would even sell our tzaddikim for shoes or our poor people for some sum of money. And I was reflecting that in both cases, they're brothers, right? Esav is Yaakov's brother, just like Reuven is Yosef's brother. But over the course of history, Esav became the outside and Reuven became the inside. And I don't think that's a small thing that happened over the course of history, but I think it is notable, right, that even as Amos laments how far we've fallen as a Jewish culture, we don't deserve the same lambasting that Edom does. And I don't think I have anything else to say. I welcome if anyone wants to share, but that was, to me, a very notable shift in this week's parsha, in this week's Haftarah. It was having to shift from an external bad guy to dealing and grappling with our own actions and how they affect all of us over the course of time. So if we were learning Amos, we'd think more about that now. If anyone wants to share, I'd be happy to hear, and then we'll jump into this week's actual Haftarah. Okay. Here is the Google Doc, which I'll also share on my screen right now. And I will share the second thing I was surprised to learn about the Nevi'im. And I say it with a smile because I have so much classic Jewish education and I still was surprised by this. And I don't think it is, I went to many excellent schools and I had very wise, oops, sorry, there's a typo here. Many wise parents who also learned with me. So I don't think it's a comment on the system. It's more a comment on just how little we focus on Navi in sort of a consistent way, perhaps. So the Haftarah that we read this week is from Zechariah. Zechariah is the 11th of the Treyasar. So I think part of my confusion, which I'll share with you in a minute, comes from the fact that normally we don't spend a lot of time in the Treyasar in day school or seminary or college courses. We focus on Yeshayahu and we focus on Yirmiyahu and we learn all of Shmuel and Shoftim and Malachim Aleph and Bet, right? And the Haftarahs draw heavily from the Treyasar, which again is, I don't have anything in particular to say about it, but just that I think that the fact that the minor prophets spoke so deeply to us is interesting. It's also probably because the minor prophets have very little plot line. It's mostly just the revelations of the prophet, and so it can connect more easily to our parshiot than the plot does at times. Zechariah's nevuah took place during the reign of Darius the Great, and he was the contemporary of Haggai, another prophet. And so this is my revelation that I didn't understand. I didn't understand how many Nevi'im were sort of wandering around Israel at the same time. Right, last week we discovered that perhaps Obadiah is a contemporary of Yeshayahu, Yirmiyahu, and Amos. Right? And here we learn that Zechariah and Haggai are contemporaries. And so I don't know the answer to this, and I'd have to do a lot more research and try to figure out what it is through some like history class, I suppose. But I wonder like if they spoke to each other, if there was like a Navi support group, if they ever sort of like strayed into each other's like catchment areas, or if there were like clear delineating lines, because again, these are the more some of the more minor prophets, and so I think they probably were more than that guy standing on his soapbox like ranting in a Times Square, but I also don't know what kind of privilege they had with each other, with the kings. I don't know, but it was notable to me that this is several times in that I've noticed that they're contemporary Nevi'im around the same time. The book is a bit longer than the last few Nevi'im that we've looked at. It is 14 chapters. Our Haftarah comes from the first part, but I just put this here just for a holistic look at the book. And so the beginning recalls our nation's history for the purpose of presenting a solemn warning to the present generation. This is taken from Zechariah. And then chapters 7 and 8 were delivered 2 years later. Zechariah was very specific about dating his writing, which is something most prophets don't do. So we have a much better sense of what was going on for him. And was an answer to the question whether the days of mourning for the destruction of the city should be kept any longer. Which I think is an interesting question, and one that they asked the Navi, also to me an interesting cultural exchange. But Zechariah is someone who is encouraging to the people. He's not all fire and brimstone, assuring them of God's presence and blessing. And then the last several chapters consist of 2 prophecies or burdens. The first prophecy is an outline of God's providential dealings with his people. And the second is the glories that await Israel in the latter days, the final conflict and triumph of God's kingdom. So that's a little bit about Zechariah as we usually outline the Nevi'im as they come up. Any questions or thoughts before we look at some actual Haftarah texts? Okay. So here is what I want to do. I want to look, and I ask for your indulgence because this stretches out a little past our 7th pasuk of this chapter. But I want us to read the next chunk together of 1 to 14 and think about, if we were artists, and maybe we have some artists among us, how we would depict this image. And then to think about if there are any images that exist in the world that remind us of this image. And to think a little bit about those implications. So here we have the text of the beginning of chapter 4. And the whole Haftarah is this interesting dialogue between the good angel, who is like the defender of Bnei Israel, and the bad angel, who's like the lawyer on the other side of the table, who is accusing Bnei Israel. And I thought about going down that road about the Satan, but that was the imagery of the Satan is not pleasant in the Gemara. And here the good angel is talking to Zachariah. He wakes me up as a man who is wakened from sleep. And he says to him, Ma atabro. So Zachariah is shown a vision. And he answers, Ra'iti, v'hine menorat zahav, kula v'gula al rosha, v'shiv'a neroteha aleha, shiva v'shiva mutzakot l'nerot asher al rosha. So Zachariah sees a lampstand all of gold with a bowl above it. The lamps on it are 7 in number, and the lamps above it have 7 pipes. Right? So far, even I don't need to be such a good artist, right, to imagine that this looks probably like the menorah that's in the temple. And then he goes on, Ushnaim zeitim aleha, echad miyamin hagula ve'echad al smola. And there are 2 olive branches that flank the bowl, one on its right and one on its left. And Zechariah doesn't get it. And actually, I thought about bringing this Rashi at the beginning of Zechariah, who basically says no one gets it. This is a confusing book. Any getting it that was to be done would have been in a much more current, to a much more current reader than we are. And so all of this has sort of been lost. The meaning, the exact meaning, has been lost to time. Which I just thought was extraordinarily humble of Rashi. He says, I'm going to give it a go, but it's not going to be clear because it's just not written to be accessible to us as modern readers. And Rashi was saying that, right, in the 1100s. But Zechariah is also unclear, right? He turns to the angel and he says, what do these things mean? And the angel says, don't you know? And he says, no, right? And then he explains sort of the analogy between the menorah and maybe the current time in Israel. And it's not, or the future vision of what Israel will be, and it's a beautiful vision. And then we see that there is a further sort of explanation of what these things that he saw are, right? And so, right, they are those 7 are the eyes of the Lord ranging over the whole earth. So the 7 stalks of the menorah in some way relate to the eyes of God, but whatever that means to us, right? And what I asked him are those 2 olive trees, Shnei hazeitim ha'ela al yamin hamenorah v'al smola. What are those 2 olive trees, one on the right and one on the left of the lampstand? And he further asked, what are mashtei shibulei hazeitim asher b'yad shnei santorot hazahav hamirikim me'aleham hazahav? What are the 2 tops of the olive trees that feed their gold through those 2 golden tubes? And again, the angel almost plays with Zechariah, and he says, don't you know what they are? And he has to admit, no, I really don't know. And the angel finishes by saying, Ela shnei b'nei hayitzar, which is here translated as 2 anointed dignitaries. And we'll see a little bit more about that in a bit. But literally, it means they are like the sons of the olive oil, ha'omdim al adon kol ha'aretz, to attend the Lord of all the earth. So before we look at pictures, what is there anything, if you were drawing a picture, if you could draw it with your words, any imagery that you would add to our picture?
Well, I pulled up on Google pictures of the gold lampstand in Zechariah.
Okay.
And they're interesting.
Okay. Can you show us one? Is that possible?
Yeah. So you'd have to go off the screen share.
Oh, sorry. Hold on. I can do that. There you go. Okay. Okay, great. So I see several very different things here, right? you know what, Bobby, if you tell me what you Googled, I'll reshare my screen and I will Google it so that we can look at the same things.
Picture of the gold lampstand in Zechariah.
Okay, so let's see what Bobby saw, because I think what I liked about these images, okay, great.
That's it, right.
Okay, none of these are what I'm going to show you, which is interesting. Any of these what people were picturing? Did anyone have a picture in their head? So these, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Sherry.
I thought you were talking about angels. I'm confused.
About angels. Okay, right. So sorry. So in Zechariah, in this text, it's a dialogue between an angel and Zechariah about a vision that he's seeing. And the vision is of a lampstand all of gold with a bowl above it. And the lamp has seven lamps, seven pipes, and there's an olive tree on either side. That's sort of, do you see that here? That's this text from verses 3 and 4. Sorry, from 2 and 3.
Got it.
Okay. So that's right, that's part one. And then there's this little elaboration at the end that there are two tops of the olive trees that feed their gold through those two golden tubes. So it's very unclear, right? It's interesting here. So first of all, these do look like olive trees on either side, right? I have picked olives before. It was one of the most boring afternoons of my life. But it's not like blueberries where you can enjoy some on the way. But these look like olive trees to me. This one has like that interesting analogy to the last part of the verses that I brought, where it talks about maybe feeding into a tube. Ooh, I like this. Judith has brought an accessory, an example. Yeah, I see it. That's
Okay.
beautiful.
My image it really is influenced by this plate that my husband brought back from a glass artist's shop in Venice in the Jewish ghetto. And
Wow.
I don't know if you can see, but on top of the olive trees on each side is, I'm sorry, I've got a right-left confusion on this screen.
It's very difficult. It's tricky.
There are bowls of presumably olives on the top branches of the tree, and out of which golden tubes feed the little bowls of the arms of the menorah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Can people see that?
yeah, I wish I could get the whole
You
thing
could
on
see
here.
that even
Oh,
without
there we
my
go.
share. See, so there's the menorah that's there, and
There's the
Judith is pointing
trees.
out then the trees on either side, sort of flanking the lampstands, right?
I'm not sure what the floral on the bottom is, but on top you can see what's holding the olives is shaped like a medieval oil lamp.
Mm-hmm. Right, because it seems like the trees are somehow feeding the branches of the menorah. That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that, Judith.
Wires go to each one.
And I think actually that Judith's plate looks the closest to what the medieval or the ancient images were. I'm going to shift back here. And we're going to come back to Rashi in a moment, right? But that's very similar, I think, to what Judith had, right? This is a mosaic depiction of Zechariah. Does this remind anyone of any modern image that you've seen in your life? I'm fishing. Maybe this one?
That one, yeah.
So I don't know if it is resonant, right? It doesn't have that sort of self-feeding element that Judith's plate has and that this ancient bowl has. And I'm struggling right now to remember what the names of the men who made the seal are. They were brothers. Does anyone remember their names? They don't ever mention They've done a lot of recordings on creating the seal, and they don't ever talk about Zachariah. The Shamir brothers, Maxim and Gabriel Shamir, are the brothers who won the contest to create this national state emblem. And they don't talk about Zachariah at all. But I think it is super interesting how similar, at least on some level, right? Having the lampstands with the golden bowl and the 7 tubes and the olive trees on either side, to me feels like very resonant. I don't know if they were religious. I bet that they weren't. They might never have heard Zachariah's prophecy, which in some ways to me makes it even more sort of like woo-woo compelling, that they somehow got that same image in their mind of a time where Zachariah is talking about how God will protect the people. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts or reflections on that.
Well, I went to Wikipedia, and it says that it's based on the menorah, but it also said the emblem may be based on the vision of the biblical prophet Zechariah, chapter 4.
Yeah, but only maybe, right? I guess
Maybe.
the Shamirs must have passed on, because otherwise we could ask them.
Yeah.
But yes, certainly it's hard for I think for a biblical scholar to see this and say it's not based on Zechariah in some way. And I wonder, again, knowing nothing about the Shamirs, why they would choose, right, Zechariah as part of the Treasar, sort of tucked away in its own place. Why they might have chosen to use, right, they could have used an olive branch and a menorah in any number of ways, but to flank the menorah with olive branches, al hayamin v'al hasmola, just like the psukim say, I think is interesting. I'm not sure what it says. Maybe it's not interesting, but to me, there's something about sort of the residue of such a prophecy, and the fact that it was such a powerful but confusing prophecy. Maybe something about how it ends in triumph, right? That maybe that we want the state seal to be something that will end in triumph. And I wonder if they thought of the olive branches like these 2 anointed dignitaries on either side, because they are omdim al adon kol haaretz. They attend to, or maybe they stand for what God stands for on earth. And to think of Israel as like an ambassador to God's will on earth maybe sounds a little bit Christian in some ways, but I think is also a very beautiful depiction of what we think of as the state of Israel meant to be, right? Sort of like, right, the Puritans and the light on the hill, right? The beacon on the hill of democracy. This is like the olive branch dignitaries of God's mission here on earth. So I don't know if anyone has any thoughts about that comparison. I'd be happy to hear it before we sort of move on to our last thoughts here. Okay, moving along. So the last thing that I wanted to do is as I was looking through this, and I will admit sort of, in the afternoon, which is not usually when I like to prepare my source sheets, thinking what else was sort of interesting about this, right? This is the connection, the tie-in to Hanukkah, of course, the menorah, the Chanukiah. And so I found 2 Rashis and 1 piece of Bamidbar Rabbah that I thought that were interesting and maybe would be worth unpacking here. So the first is Rashi is commenting on the early part of the chapter about the depiction of the olive branches or the olive trees on either side of the menorah. And he says, "V'chan lo piresh al shnei tzintarot zahav ha'amurot lamata beparsha." Right? He doesn't. The prophecy is split in 2. Right? He doesn't talk about those 2 golden vats that are mentioned below in the chapter, which are the sorts of bowls or vats of the olive press. Right? I don't want to steal Rav Hodi's thunder. I was talking to him about this, and I pulled back a little because he's going to give a fantastic shiur on Sunday morning after davening at around 10 a.m. in the in the sanctuary, or maybe in Berger, because I believe there will be donuts involved. And he is talking about the menorah and Titus's arch and all of these interesting things. And I'm sure it'll be really, really great. I wish I could be there. I encourage you to go if you can. But we were talking about this idea of this sort of almost like a machine-like way that like the olive branches themselves like somehow feed their olives into the vats that stand beside the olive trees, right? The olives beat themselves into the vats and are heated there as if in a vat or a pit where olives are generally packed. There they are pressed in the oil press, and the oil falls into the vats, and from the vats into the bowl, and from the bowl into the tubes, and from the tubes into the lamps, right? It's like, it feels to me like, oh gosh, what's that? There's a guy who like you push a tennis ball and then, a million other things happen. And finally, like a machine pours you a cup of coffee.
Rube Goldberg machine.
Thank you. Yes, this feels like a Rube Goldberg machine to me, right? There's like something very fanciful, sort of whimsical about this whole idea that the olive trees somehow deposit their own oil into the menorah, which I found very appealing. Also, if you think about sort of like sustainable or renewable energy, right? Like it comes from the olives into the menorah. And then he has this thing about light, which I love, and I will talk about in Hanukkah as well, that the tubes and the lamps number 49, Arba'im V'Tesha, because they are a remez la'or shela'atid lavo. They're an allusion to the light of like the future. Or sha'atid lavo or hachama yeh shaba'atayim ka'or shel shiv'at yamim arba'im v'tesha al or shel yom breshit. That we are promised that the sun, the future in the light of the sun, will be sevenfold the light of the 7 days, right? So if the 7 days of creation, sevenfold will mark 49 tubes, and lo and behold, if you count up all the tubes that he mentions, there are 49 of them. And so this is really like Zechariah's prophecy is one of great hope, right? That we're not talking necessarily about the next temple, although I'm sure that they are hoping for that. But we're talking about this temple in like the Or Shala'atid Lavo, some sort of future time where the light will be so bright, it will be 7 times as bright as the light of creation. And so I think that, especially in dark times, especially times like these, right? Thinking about a light that can shine that bright is so attractive, right? It's such a beautiful thing to have. So this menorah is especially bright, maybe because of its really cool Rube Goldberg way of filling itself up, and maybe because it has this mystical 49 tubes, which allude to a light that we have not yet seen in this world. So that is the first Rashi I wanted to share. And then the second Rashi, following with Bamidbar Rabbah here, is talking about what are these B'nai Hayitzhar that are standing on either side, right? We know in the vision they're olive branches, but what are they really? They're not really the sons of olive branches. And so Rashi gives 2 different answers, because as I said at the beginning, right, Rashi is also a little bit confused about this parak of Zechariah. So the first option is Karen Kuhuna v'Malchut, right? The horns of the priesthood and the kingdom, who Hanim Shachim v'Shemen HaMishcha, the ones that are anointed with oil. And Bamidbar Rabbah explains this a little bit further. I like that in the English, it asks rhetorically, and does oil have sons? I don't see that in the Hebrew, but it's a funny question, right? The sons of Ishtar, what does that mean? And so they say, Ze Aharon v'David, right? So the kahuna is Aaron, David is the kingdom, and that they asked for this. They requested it, and they stand on either side. So you can almost imagine if we wanted to give the olive trees faces, one would be Aaron, like in his priestly hat, and one would be David with maybe like his, kingly wardrobe. And that those are, I think we can imagine what Rashi is saying is like, those are the founding blocks of our society. Is like that kahuna, that spiritual leadership, and the malchut, the more political leadership, or the like feet on the ground, less spiritual, more practical leadership that we need. And with those leaders flanking our menorah, not actually Aaron and David, but those two different pieces of leadership, that we will be able to have this menorah that burns so bright. And I think that that's a beautiful way of thinking about society in general. You know, the rabbi and the shul president, the right, the said it for you, Debbie. Right, the for any good, right, society, if not even a religious advisor, right, but like the king and his advisors, that there has to be sort of a balance, you know, I guess is what I was thinking, a check and a balance, the spiritual, the practical, the political, the, you know, divine, whatever those two ways are, but, you know, approaching them from different directions. But the other Rashi, which I want to leave us with, which I think is interesting, is Shnei b'nei hayitzar, yetzer tov v'yetzer hara, mitapach latov b'zchut haTorah. So I started by sharing briefly with Bobby that I just heard a shir about the very first Rashi of this week's Parsha, which is about Vayeshev Yaakov. I think I taught a shir on this Rashi to maybe some group of these people a while back, which is that Vayeshev Yaakov is generally understood to be that Yaakov wanted to settle down, to sort of relax in his old age, to not have all the drama that had like preceded his lifetime. And that Rashi quotes a midrash that that God, or perhaps the Satan, says to Yaakov. He sort of pokes fun at him, and he says, "Do you really think you are going to have quiet in this lifetime? Tzaddikim don't get quiet in this lifetime; they get quiet in the life to come, in Olam Haba." And basically, what I think people understand that Rashi to be saying is like there is no good times for people in this world, because your good times are coming in the next world. And so, you know, if you're having a good time in this world, it's not a good sign, right? It means that the next world is not going to be as good for you. Maybe you're not the tzaddik that you thought you were. And people understand it to be a very harsh Rashi, right? Very hard for Yaakov. And my favorite understanding of this piece is from a text called the Shari Ora, which is a Hasidic text, which says that there's another place where Yaakov is Yeshev, where he's sitting. He's an Ish Yoshev Ohalim. He's someone who sits in tents. And what they say is he sat in both the tents of Shem and in Aver, or the tents in both Abraham and Yitzchak, his grandfather and his father, meaning that Yaakov, his strength came not in having harmony, but in being able to harmonize the tensions, right? He could sit in two tents and come out feeling like he wasn't torn in two. That he could have both things. And something about all of that sort of backstory, and then looking at this, where Rashi starts to say it's the Yetzer HaTov on one side and the Yetzer Hara on the other side. But then he says, actually, the Yetzer Hara is mitapech latov. It's actually converted to good in the merit of the Torah. Somehow I heard like a connection to our Parsha and echo here. I don't know if I was like reaching too far, but this idea about like whether it was God talking to Yaakov or the Satan, right? The good inclination or the evil inclination, whether our evil inclination is converted to good, or whether maybe it just exists, right? Maybe we need that balance of having, right, being Yoshev Ohalim, having the evil inclination on one side and the good on the other. What does it mean to read this all together? Is that what I hear is the olive branches signify two good inclinations, one that used to be bad but has been converted to good, and one that was always good. And in some ways, it's much more interesting to have the Yetzer HaTov on one side and just a pure Yetzer Hara on the other side, right? And maybe somehow the menorah balances the two. I don't know. Again, I heard this sort of echo of this thing, maybe because I was already thinking about it when I was looking at the Parsha. Because truthfully, Zechariah is not meant to echo our Parsha. It's meant to echo Hanukkah. That's why it's read on Shabbat Hanukkah. But this is maybe an understanding of what these olive trees are, either a balanced government of some sort or balanced leadership, or a balance of our good and bad wills, our ability to hold two different models on either side of the menorah and still have them all pour into the same place, right? the good and the bad, the kahuna and the malchut, they all feed that same menorah, and they all feed a light that is otherworldly, that is something that will be in the future. Right, we say that the number 7 is the number of completion, and the number 8 sort of takes us off of the grid paper altogether. It flies us into another dimension. It's like a godly number, right? And so the fact that we have 8 days of Hanukkah, I think, is very significant. And it brings us to this light of this other world. So may we all merit to see that light this Hanukkah, sooner than Zot Hanukkah, tomorrow, Thursday at Hanukkah time. And I hope Zechariah is a comforting prophet. I'm happy that we're back on solid ground with nice prophecies to read during the Haftarah. But I welcome thoughts, questions, ideas about Hanukkah, Zechariah, Amos.
Speaking of Hanukkah, and it's a Freilich time of year, my understanding, I mean, I know I read a while ago that Sadiqim get not necessarily punishment, but I can't think of the right word, for littler sins than somebody else, because they're Sadiqim and God expects more from them. However, there's also another part that I read in the Torah, or some book about the Torah, I can't remember which, where it's a mitzvah to create for yourself happiness, a happy life. I just thought I would throw that there.
Yes, I think, right, referring to Yaakov, perhaps it's not that he lived a bad life because he was a tzaddik who would get a good life in the future. And perhaps it's not because good people get bad things in this world, but because good people are held to a higher standard. For sure, that's a fair read of that piece.
And that it's your responsibility to create for yourself a Freilich life.
And in some ways that leads back to those bowls on top of the menorah, right? Which is that we have to be able to be self-feeding in some way, right? We have to be able to take the olives that we produce, the fruits that we produce, and pour them into the vats ourselves and press them down and get them into the light of the menorah, right? We can't wait for someone to do that for us. I like that. We have to take that initiative. That's beautiful.
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
I can't help thinking, whenever the imagery involves the priesthood on one hand and the kingship on the other, that there's a third element, the prophet. Talking about checks and balances, it's those three that really lead Israel. And of course, the image, the depictions don't explicitly mark the role of the prophet.
What if the prophet
menorah,
is
if the menorah is Israel, but it can also be in the sense that would we all be prophets and
That's
the holy
beautiful.
people?
I like that.
What somewhere in the commentaries here, and I've lost it, I can't find it in my book, the notion that the trees are producing the olives and the olives produce the oil. It's not the prophet, it's not anybody, it's not anyone human who's feeding that menorah to create the light. It's God, it's the divine spirit that's making those trees do what they do. We have nothing to do with it, really. And the prophet is the one with the perspective to see that and to see how, if it's negative versus positive, which frankly the image doesn't explicitly say, but if that's how it's to be interpreted, the one who has the understanding to pass on how our negative impulses and our positive impulses do serve one another, that you almost couldn't have one without the other. Appreciate what goodness is without.
Yeah. I
consequence.
like that you brought in the prophet also, right? I wasn't thinking about him. I wonder if the Navi is the little bowls that sit on top, right? The one who sort of filters what God
Right,
gives us.
right, exactly.
You know,
That's-
that's also a nice way of thinking about it.
I was wondering where the mosaic came from because it's the painting I have here on the dish is so much like it. In terms of detail.
There's a lovely rabbi named Rabbi Tzvi Sinensky, who makes many beautiful source sheets. He lives in Philadelphia. I happen to know him. He's a big Talmid Chacham. I stole it shamelessly from his source sheet. I will say that when I was talking to Rav Hodi about it, that there's an illuminated manuscript that had a very similar picture to what Rav Hodi sent me. Let's see if I can manage to pull that. Oh, I don't know that I'm going to be able to. I can't remember how he sent it to me, but I'll see if I can find it. That's very, very similar. So it could be that it comes from that manuscript, or that it's hard to say, or if it's a mosaic that was found on like the floor of a shul somewhere, perhaps the manuscript comes from the mosaic. Yeah, very similar. I will look for it.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I wish everyone a very happy Hanukkah filled with light. Next week, we will meet on Tuesday night, but it will not be about the Haftarah. I know I'm a little sad already, but instead about Hanukkah. I think we'll look at the similarities between Hanukkah and Sukkot and what that means about what that has to say about the light we create on Hanukkah. So that's the plan, subject to change. So I hope to see you then. And Rav Hodi is giving a beautiful shir on Sunday morning about the menorah at 10 o'clock following davening with donuts. Lots of other great Hanukkah programming in our calendar and in the bulletin. And I hope to see you all soon. I'll be in town, not this Shabbat, but next Shabbat.
I'll be here next
Happy Hanukkah.
Bye. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you very
so
much.
much.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
Happy Hanukkah.